without Easter, there would be no Christianity. That might be the only definitive thing I can say about Easter and the resurrection. Whatever it was that constituted the Easter experience, the obvious fact is that there was enormous power in that moment. That power changed lives. It redefined the way people thought about God. It created new consciousness. And in time, it would even cause a new holy day to be born. Each of these changes points beyond itself to something that must be big enough to account for these possibilities. What that something is, I've been professionally preaching about Easter for 30 years, over 30 years, and I am becoming more and more convinced that there is less and less that I can say definitively about Easter. Maybe that's because I've become more and more convinced that that something that I was just talking about has to do with the mystery that we call God. And therefore it is cloaked in whatever is beyond our understandings and experience of time and space. Because God is beyond our experiences of time and space. Our language, our ability to conceive and imagine is somewhat limited by our own understandings and experiences of time and space. So when we talk about something beyond our experience of time and space, we stumble. We tell stories that are bound in our experience of time and space. I think that's why if you look at the four gospel accounts of the resurrection in the four gospels, you get at least four and probably at least six, because of later editors, different stories. 6 different narrative streams written to explain the unexplainable. The stories are filled with factual contradictions, especially if you literalize the stories. So one approach, one progressive approach, might be to simply dismiss Easter. Dismiss the resurrection. Ignore it. But as I said moments ago, without Easter there would be no Christianity, and we have Christianity. So there must have been an Easter. Let's take a few moments to look at what the Scriptures have to say about this. Start with Paul's letter, the section that we heard from his letter to the church in Corinth. I want to start there because Paul is the oldest writings that we have in the New Testament. He wrote his letters probably a generation, maybe 2 generations before Luke wrote his gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. The passage contains Jesus' description of Easter. It's pretty brief. Christ was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas and to the 12. Want to flesh that out a bit, Paul? The first thing we notice here is that Paul is saying that God acted. Jesus was raised. Some external force acted on him. Something beyond him. But raised to what? I suppose there's another definitive thing I can say about Easter, but it's not about what Easter is, it's about what Easter isn't. Paul is not talking about resuscitation. In other letters that scholars agree are authentically written by Paul, it becomes clear, for instance, in Romans, Paul writes, Christ being raised from the dead will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. If being raised means being resuscitated, Jesus would die again. But if he's never going to die again, as Paul claims, being raised means something other than resuscitation. Elsewhere in Romans and in Philippians, Paul writes about how the resurrection brings Jesus into oneness with God. Not that I can really explain what that means, though the image of the resurrection bringing Jesus into oneness with God does reinforce the idea of what did not inspire those early New Testament authors. Easter was not a restoration of Jesus to life of this world. They were inspired by something else. They were inspired by the sense that in some manner God had raised Jesus into being part of who God is. Jesus was raised by God into God. Paul does say that the resurrected Christ appeared to Peter. Cephas is Aramaic for Peter, and to the 12, meaning the other disciples. And Paul goes on to say that the raised Jesus appeared to hundreds of followers. Finally, the raised Jesus appeared to Paul himself. And when I hear the word appeared, I think, I can see, right? But as Mark said when he introduced the reading, that for Paul, at least according to Luke, when Luke wrote the book of Acts, Paul's experience of the resurrected Christ was a disembodied voice and a bright light. And that, Paul says, was appearance. Saul, why do you persecute me? This disembodied voice demanded. Paul's life, Saul, he went by that name at that point. Saul's life was so turned around by this appearance of the resurrected Christ that he went from being a chief persecutor of Jesus' followers to being a chief evangelist for the movement, and he changed his name from Saul to Paul. John Shelby Spong says that this example points to an understanding that the resurrection was a movement of new revelation that occurred when survival-driven humanity could transcend the limits and give itself away in love to others, including even those who wish and do us evil. As I read this, I think Spong is saying that the resurrection of Jesus happened, or perhaps continues to happen, when this revelation and transformation happens. I wonder if our resurrection happens also when these revelations and transformations happen. What is clear to me is that Spong is saying that resurrection is about God and human life flowing together, and that whatever it was that happened on that first Easter, it persuaded believers that every limit on our humanity can be broken. Luke, as I said, was probably written a generation or two after Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Spong thinks that Luke had literalized the resurrection stories. I wonder if that's true. How do I make real to you what I know is real in my heart? How do I explain to you the unexplainable? How do I help you understand a mystery? How do I help you know the way I know that Christ is resurrected? I tell a story. So Luke tells stories. You can take them literally if you want to. I don't think Luke did. I think he tells the story to invite us into the story. Early in the morning at first light, a group of women who supported Jesus' ministry from the beginning go to the place where his body was buried. They come bearing precious herbs and oils to wash the body of their Lord. They come to comb out Jesus' hair, to sponge away the dried blood, to massage precious myrrh into his skin. They hope to engage in a ritual act, an act of caring that is traditionally done before the body is sealed in a tomb. They've come to anoint the crucified one. Yet even as they discuss how they'll gain access to the cave, after all, it is closed with a massive boulder, they find that the stone has been rolled away and the tomb is empty, vacant. And suddenly there are two men in dazzling clothes standing beside them, and they're afraid. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. These two dazzling men say to the women. The women return to the enclave of Jesus' followers. They tell what happened to the 11 and the rest of the people, and the 11 and the others think what they're hearing is an idle tale. Only Peter gets up and goes to the tomb to see what has happened, and he ends up coming home amazed. If I'm right that Luke is not a literalist, that Luke is telling a story to try to explain the unexplainable, to invite us into that story, if the resurrected Christ hadn't appeared to us, then we might think possibly like the people in the Jesus enclave thought of the stories the woman told, that they're an idle tale. The story of life out of death is an idle tale. If, on the other hand, we've seen that something happened and something keeps happening to people's lives, then maybe we'll be like the women and keep showing up at gravesides. Or maybe we'll be like Peter and find ourselves wandering home amazed. The resurrection, or at least a progressive understanding of the resurrection, is an ongoing and life-ordering process, not an event that happened once in history long ago, but an event that happens all the time. Alleluia, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed, alleluia. This ancient salute that has greeted Easter for centuries upon centuries reminds us that Jesus has opened to us access into the meaning of God as the power to free us to live, to love, and to be. And so we learn that God is one and all of us are part of that oneness. Clarence Jordan, who in the 1940s co-founded Koinonia Farm, a small but influential multiracial religious community in the southwest of Georgia, once said, "The proof that God raised Jesus from the dead is not the empty tomb, but the full hearts of his transformed disciples. The crowning evidence that he lives is not the vacant grave, but the Spirit-filled fellowship, not a rolled-away stone, but a carried-away church. May we be carried away." Amen.